Hello, today we will be talking about the roots of abolitionism. Over the course of this video we will be looking at two major objectives. After watching this video I hope you are able to analyze the origins of the abolition movement and analyze the effects of the abolition movement on sectionalism, which leads us to our two essential questions of the day. 1. Why did abolitionist views develop in the 1830s? And 2. How did abolitionism fundamentally alter sectionalism in the U.S.? First, we have to examine the very complex situation through which abolitionism became a major movement in America. There are several main factors, some of which we have already discussed in previous classes that don't really differ from earlier eras in American history, and others which develop in the specific historical context of the 1830s. Let's review what we already know about slavery from previous eras in American history. These will end up being the political and economic forces that will result in the development of abolitionism. During the American Revolution, it was not unheard of to be against the idea of slavery. Indeed, it was difficult to reconcile some American principles like equality with the practice of owning slaves. However, freedom and equality were not the only things the Founding Fathers were worried about at this time. Being a new country, the Founding Fathers were very concerned about stability. Having just broken free from Britain, the U.S. needed to make sure that its government would last for the long term. This required the cooperation of southern states, which of course owned slaves. As such, slavery became a political necessity. The first conflict in the United States over slavery was solved in an agreement known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. This compromise guaranteed that in terms of state representation, the U.S. would allot representatives to southern states on the basis that slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person. People often wonder why the North decided to compromise on this issue. Well, one reason was because slavery was considered a temporary problem at the time. Many were hoping that the slave system would just die out naturally. However, this all changed with the revolutionary invention of the cotton gin. The cotton gin made slavery systems much more profitable, and the South completely began to invest in them. While the South invested in slavery, the North went a different route, utilizing factory labor. With the development of industrialization, people began to realize that factory labor was much more efficient at producing goods than slave labor. Thus, many northern states began to outlaw slavery. And therein lies the economic reasons for abolitionism. This would result in a very important split of an industrial economy in the North to an agrarian economy in the South. We'll come back to this split several times over the course of the next few units. To move forward a bit, let's talk about the next compromise that involved slavery. From the invention of the cotton gin till about 1819, slavery was generally accepted as an important part of the Southern economy. 1819 was a landmark year for the debate over slavery. In 1819, the state of Missouri applied for statehood in the U.S. By this point, the North had begun to become a little bit concerned about the effects of slavery on their political designs. Ultimately, a political compromise was reached that added Maine as a free state in the North, with Missouri as a slave state toward the South. In addition, a line was drawn to prevent future debates from breaking out. This line was on the border between Missouri and Arkansas and became known as the Missouri Compromise Line. For the time being, this solved, rather delayed, any issues with slavery. I want to make an important distinction between the issues that the North has had with slavery so far and the ideas of abolition. The attempt to stop the spread of slavery during this period was not necessarily a condemnation against slavery itself, but was an attempt to retain control, or at least balance, in the U.S. government between states with agrarian and states with industrial interests. However, this struggle for political power would be a very important cause that would drive people toward anti-slavery attitudes. Which leads us to our final major cause for the development of the abolition movement: moral and spiritual causes. Ultimately, this pushed people to not just want to stop the spread of slavery, but to eradicate it entirely.
Many of you knew Kenny McCormick. He was a playful school-going 8-year-old, and then yesterday, he was smacked down by the Lord.
Okay, so probably not literally like that. Nonetheless, a similar movement, based on the sermons of passionate religious preachers, began to develop in the Americas. This movement became known as the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a revival of religious ideas in the United States. Morality became very important to society at large. This religious revival revitalized the seeming contradiction between the ideas of liberty and equality compared with those of forced labor and servitude. From these religious concerns of morality, individuals began to voice themselves publicly on their anti-slavery stances. This caused the development of two wings of the anti-slavery movement: the Free Soilers, who were against the spread of slavery, and the Abolitionists, who believed that slavery should be eliminated altogether. Concerns on slavery were no longer just economic and political, but also moral and spiritual. Although only a small group at first, the abolition movement continued to gain strength as a result of the moral concerns raised by the Second Great Awakening. By 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, a renowned abolitionist, published his first abolitionist newspaper. By the 1840s, abolitionist ideas were even being considered by members of Congress. This is evidenced by the Wilmot Proviso, a bill that would outlaw slavery in territories acquired during the Mexican-American War. While this bill did not pass, it is still evidence of an increasing feeling of anti-slavery sentiment growing throughout the country. Shortly after, in the 1850s, abolitionists were actively fighting against the system of slavery, both in the courtroom against the Dred Scott decision, and in actual violent outbreaks, such as John Brown's actions in the Bleeding Kansas crisis. We will talk about all of these events in more depth later in the unit. Which brings us to our second major question. There was a clear difference between the events between 1830 and 1860 and the debates of the Founding Fathers in the 1780s and 1790s. Abolition by the 1840s and 1850s was not just a political or economic issue, but also a moral and spiritual problem. While not a majority of the northern population, there were enough abolitionists to threaten Southern interests. By the late 1850s, Southerners now believed that abolition was an inevitability if they remained a part of the United States. The only way to ensure that they would avoid abolition and control by Northern politics would be to dissolve the political bonds between themselves and the North and to form their own country. Like in the times of the Articles of Confederation, concerns for unity ultimately would trump those for political, economic, and moral high ground from the 1830s until the 1860s. However, the die was cast with the development of the abolition movement. With industrialist desires to limit agrarian influence in the U.S. government and the increasing moral concern of the nation's citizens, the U.S. was headed into conflict. Slavery became an irreconcilable wedge that divided the North and South in two and started a civil war. The Civil War settled not only a political or economic struggle, but also a moral struggle. The struggle over and the subsequent defeat of slavery was important as the U.S. attempted to live up to its motto of having liberty and justice for all.